Thank you for having me. I'm an educator, and I'm going to talk today a little bit about how the D.School's curriculum is continuing to evolve as we get older and older. So as I was thinking about what I wanted to speak with you about today, I started realizing that I've been noticing a certain phrase everywhere. And once I started paying attention, I realized I could not stop seeing the phrase, "The future is more uncertain than ever." I started seeing it used to describe geopolitical issues, like the future of Palestinian-Israeli peace is more uncertain than ever. That's from a UN report. I started seeing it on more personal, familiar issues, like the future of a comfortable retirement. I saw it around health and medical issues. It's popping up around large-scale disaster relief. I think we can all say it certainly feels like the weather outlook is more uncertain than ever. And my personal favorite, the future of cannabis banking is more uncertain than ever, especially if you are a Colorado congressman. So I can tell you that one thing seems clear, which is more people are saying more things are more uncertain than ever. And as I started seeing this pattern, I started wondering, what is it about this phrase at this particular moment that feels so resonant, that feels like across all of these different sectors that it really is describing something important? Because actually what I can tell you is that the future is exactly the same degree of uncertain that it always is. Right? The future is just always fundamentally uncertain. We don't know what it holds. And humans are hardwired to try to make sense out of chaos, right? We see pictures in the clouds, we look at tea leaves and try to understand what that might mean for our lives. We look at large amounts of data and we try to project trends and understand forecasts and make some educated guesses about what the future will hold. But the harsh reality is we just don't know. And despite this kind of fundamental truth, this can feel really terrible and perilous. So I started digging into this a little bit. And one of the people who is a real source of inspiration on this topic is a writer and historian named Rebecca Solnit. And in her book, Hope in the Dark, she talks about how people really tend to mix up two elements of how we think about the future. So when we think about the future being dark, we think about it being not just inscrutable or unknowable, but terrible. Such is our desire to have some degree of certainty that we would rather believe that there's a certain negative outcome rather than just acknowledge that the future could get better, it could get worse, and we just don't know. So she really eloquently states this. She says, "We transform the future's unknowability into something certain, the fulfillment of all our dread, the place beyond which there is no way forward." And if you're a designer, if you're trying to look at the world from a creative standpoint, that's a scary place to be, right? That's not one that gives you a lot of ways of thinking about how to move forward. And Solnit really counsels us throughout her writing to think about the future not with a kind of naive optimism, right, which says, I don't have to do anything because things are just eventually going to get better, or with a naive pessimism, which is, I don't have to do anything because things are definitely going to get worse, but actually a kind of informed hope. And as I was thinking about this phrase that's everywhere, the future is more uncertain than ever, and I was thinking about Solnit's writing, I think that there's also something going on at the moment that is really amplifying our feelings about uncertainty and the future. And the first of those is complexity, right? So I'm not going to dive into this. We've actually referenced this topic already yesterday. But there is broad scientific consensus that, in fact, we are living in a more complex world than we ever have before. And I think about the complexity of the moment as kind of an emotional amplifier. Right? It takes our regular, normal human feelings about uncertainty and the unpredictability of the future, and it magnifies them. And in some ways, it's making some things feel like really at an intolerable level of uncertainty. But ambiguity, I think, is really different. And I think it's a really powerful idea for us to talk about in the design community and with our students. So ambiguity is often seen as a synonym only to opaque or vague or uncertain, but it has a couple of other meanings. So ambiguity, it comes from the Latin, and it's composed of a couple of different words, one of which does mean to be uncertain. The other one means to drive, or to act, or to lead. And in combination, these two things literally mean to be uncertain and to act anyway. And because of the vagueness or the opacity that's implied when something is ambiguous, it means that more than one interpretation is possible, right? More than one solution, more than one outcome. And I think this is a really valuable idea to hold on to. And I also think it's really important in this community because navigating ambiguity is something that design does really well. Compared to how a lot of other communities of practice solve problems, this is something special about design. And it's really unusual that you have a whole community that's able to show up in a totally unfamiliar problem space, be energized by that unfamiliarity, by that newness, and actually have a set of tools and practices and kind of a disposition or a mindset that allows people to tackle those kinds of open-ended, ambiguous problems. So we've spent a lot of the last year or so really thinking about how do we foreground our teaching around ambiguity amongst our students. So I want to share a couple of those ways. For one thing, and this has been true since the start of the D.school, we really fundamentally believe that learning experiences need to be open-ended. Our students need to be working on real-world projects with real partners. So just for example, this fall, we had a class of students who were partnered with the local Veterans Administration, and they were working to help redesign the experience that veterans were having as they tried to access mental health services. Another class was working on climate change and was engaging with fishermen in the nearby coastal town of Pescadero to try to understand how those people are being disproportionately impacted by the changing ecosystem, the changing climate around them, and then take inspiration from the lives of those fishermen and try to use it to inspire behavioral change amongst people for whom climate is just a totally abstract idea. So on the one hand, you have students working to redesign and humanize a really bureaucratic institution. On the other, you have students working to try to create behavior change around these natural systems. Really wide range of challenges that we throw at our students. And none of them have any clear right answers, right? There are lots of possible outcomes that could be valuable. The faculty don't know the right answers, which is a really interesting dynamic in our classrooms. And so fundamentally, we need a way for students to acknowledge uncertainty, but to not be paralyzed by it. So another set of tools that we really instill in our students is around prototyping. And as everyone in this room knows, prototyping is a really valuable way to kind of de-risk your solutions, to rapidly iterate, to test early on before you bring something to market. And we also want our students to understand another aspect of prototyping, which is around really allowing multiple solutions to take form in parallel, right? And we want our students to be using this tool and doing it well, but also to understand conceptually why that's so important, why that is such a practical and useful tool when they're encountering ambiguous problems. We also really want students to develop an active vocabulary about how they experience ambiguity and how they approach these kinds of open-ended problems. So one tool that I am particularly fond of is a simple journey map, which I will ask students to fill out at the end of my classes. And I'll ask them to look and think about, over time, how they experienced both the learning in the class, so they'll draw a line that marks the kind of highs and lows of their learning experience. And then on the same map, also look at the emotional journey, how they were feeling along the way. And I noticed some interesting things. So let's look at a couple of them. This is one example of a student journey map. And what I'm always really interested to see is when there's a moment when the student says the learning journey is really high, but the emotional journey is really low, right? So the student is saying, I was learning a ton at that particular moment, but it felt really bad. And there's one example on this map. I think what's happening there is a concept that I've borrowed from mathematics education, which is called productive struggle. And productive struggle is a kind of empirically testable theory about learning, which says that when students encounter a set of problems that they struggle with, that they don't know the right answers to the first time, they actually wind up learning in a more deep way. They are more equipped to transfer that information and apply it to novel situations that they're in. So it's a richer kind of learning than students working on challenges that they can just nail right away at the beginning. Here are a few more examples. Another student journey map. It's one of my favorites, lots of productive struggle that this student encountered. And what is so interesting about these is that as you work with students over time, you see how as they begin to get the skills to navigate these difficult moments, they start to crave those kinds of moments, those kinds of problems. And when you start to really have the vocabulary and the tools for navigating this kind of ambiguity, you really start to kind of reject the problems that are too simple, that are too familiar, where you can kind of see the answer from the beginning. And this is a really kind of exciting moment for students. This is like a set of skills that we want to equip as many students with as possible. Now, as we've dug into this idea of navigating ambiguity, we've noticed some interesting patterns in how people start to build their own vocabulary. And we've seen that people reach for a couple of different metaphors and sort of mental models in thinking about this. So one really interesting one is kind of a journey metaphor, right? They think about a project where they're going from unknown to known, and along the way they encounter some ambiguity that's challenging. And often at the beginning, you'll see students who kind of want to get through that phase as quickly as possible. And then as they become more experienced and more confident, they want to linger, right? They want to actually invite more ambiguity into the process. And that's often true for other folks who use this metaphor around ambiguity as an ingredient, right? How can I source more ambiguity into my work? Because that's actually where the interesting solutions come from. Right? It's in those moments of productive struggle that the breakthroughs happen, that we actually create space to get to more interesting, innovative solutions. So I want to leave you with this question about how design can be an explicit champion for ambiguity, right? There are kind of two levels that I'm thinking about this question on. One is, at a personal level, as leaders or in your own organizations, how is it that you relate to ambiguity? Right? What's your mental frame around it? How do you set the tone in your companies and organizations for when people are tackling a really ambiguous problem? How are you finding ways to recognize and celebrate the talent that you have around you that's really good at navigating ambiguity or really comfortable with it? How are you using the idea of prototyping in multiple directions at once to actually foster a practical approach to dealing with ambiguous problems? And then secondly, as a broader community, how do we really start to source more ambiguity into the kind of large-scale projects that we might tackle on the important problems of our day, right? The big, messy social issues that are inherently complex, that are inherently uncertain, but that really matter. And can we be a voice for the role that ambiguity can play in our work as designers? So I'll leave you just one thought, which is that my hope is that we can start to really talk about ambiguity as a way, not that we can have to get through quickly or that makes us feel uncertain or terrible, but actually as a way for us to act, even when we feel more uncertain than ever. Thank you.